Lena Hart learned early how to make herself small. She moved through days with practiced quiet, finishing tasks before anyone asked, smiling when it was expected, leaving rooms without leaving impressions. At 31, she had a tidy apartment, a reliable job at a mid-sized marketing firm, and an ache she never named because naming it made it real. The ache lived behind her ribs and surfaced most when the city went still. Late evenings, rain tapping the windows, the hum of traffic fading into a hollow hush. That IT was during one of those evenings that Evan Brooks entered her life, though at first he arrived like any other colleague, unremarkable and neatly packaged. He joined a firm as a consultant, temporary but confident, carrying himself with the ease of someone who had learned how to win trust quickly. He shook hands firmly, remembered names, laughed at the right moments. When he met Lena's eyes, he didn't rush past them. He paused, as if listening for something beneath her words. They worked late on a campaign that first week. The office lights dimmed automatically, leaving a soft glow that made everything feel provisional, like a set that could be dismantled at any moment. Evan noticed Lena's meticulous notes and the way she rewrote copy until it felt honest. "You don't just sell ideas," he said, reading over her shoulder. "You protect them." Lena shrugged, unsure how to receive praise without deflecting it. "I just don't like shortcuts." "Neither do I," Evan replied, and it sounded like a confession. They began to talk, at first about work, then about the things that shape a person without announcing themselves. Evan spoke about moving cities, about learning to be adaptable, about the quiet pressure of expectations. He mentioned his wife, Claire, in passing, with the careful neutrality of someone reciting facts rather than feelings. Lena noted the detail and filed it away, a boundary drawn cleanly and early. Over the next weeks, the boundary blurred not because it was challenged, but because it was never discussed again. Evan and Lena found themselves in the same rooms, on the same projects, sharing the same deadlines. He learned she drank her coffee black and read poetry on her phone during lunch breaks. She learned he had once wanted to be a teacher and still carried a fondness for old bookstores. These were small things, harmless in isolation, but they stacked themselves into familiarity, and familiarity is persuasive. Marcus Reed noticed first. Marcus had a way of watching without staring, of saying what others avoided. He leaned against Lena's desk one afternoon and raised an eyebrow. "You seem lighter," he said, like someone cracked a window. Lena smiled, unsure if it was true. "Just busy." Marcus didn't push, but his eyes followed Evan as he crossed the floor, laughing with someone else. "Busy has a face now," he murmured, then walked away. The comment lingered longer than Lena expected. She told herself it was nothing, that companionship didn't automatically become dependence. Still, when Evan asked if she wanted to grab coffee after a late meeting, she said yes without thinking, and then spent the afternoon rehearsing reasons why it was normal. The cafe was small and warm, the kind of place where conversations soften. Evan talked about Claire more openly there, about routines that had hardened into habits. He never complained outright, but his pauses spoke for him. Lena listened, careful not to cross into advice. She recognized the look in his eyes, the relief of being heard, and it unsettled her because it mirrored her own. "I don't mean to unload," Evan said, staring into his cup. "I just don't usually get to say these things." "You can say them," Lena replied, and immediately wondered if she should have. They walked back separately, an unspoken agreement to preserve appearances. Yet the space between them felt newly charged, like a wire humming under tension. At night, Lena replayed the conversation, editing herself in retrospect. She told herself that empathy was not betrayal, that listening was not an invitation. The first crack appeared quietly. During a presentation, Evan faltered, losing his place. Lena stepped in seamlessly, guiding the room forward. Later, he thanked her with a look that held more than gratitude. It held reliance. She felt it settle on her shoulders, warm and heavy. Days passed. The campaign progressed. Their conversations deepened in ways that felt inevitable. Evan began to seek Lena out, not always with words, sometimes just by standing near her desk, asking a question he didn't need answered. Lena found herself anticipating those moments, measuring her day by them, and the realization startled her. Point one evening, as they reviewed final drafts, the office emptied around them. The city lights flickered on, reflected in the glass walls like distant stars. Evan closed his laptop and exhaled. Do you ever feel like you're living the version of your life that made the most sense to other people? The question slipped past Lena's defenses. She answered honestly about choosing safety, about postponing joy. Evan listened, really listened, and in that attention she felt seen in a way that made her pulse quicken. It frightened her because it felt earned, and she had not worked for it. When they finally left, the elevator stalled briefly between floors. It was nothing, seconds at most, but the pause stretched. They stood close, aware of each other's breath. Evan looked at her, and something unspoken hovered, asking to be acknowledged. The elevator moved. The moment passed. They stepped out into the night, and Lena felt both relieved and disappointed. Tea home. She lay awake, tracing the ceiling with her eyes. She thought of Claire, a woman she had never met but now imagined in fragments. She thought of Marcus's raised eyebrow. She thought of the way Evan's questions had peeled back parts of her she kept covered. None of it was dramatic, and that was what made it dangerous. The next morning, Lena arrived early and found a note on her desk, written in Evan's careful handwriting. Thank you for yesterday, for seeing me. It was simple, appropriate, and entirely too much. She folded the note and slipped it in her bag, telling herself she would throw it away later. Instead, she carried it with her through meetings and messages, a quiet weight against her side. By evening, she understood that something had shifted, not in a way anyone else could name, but in a way she could feel. The note stayed in Lena Hart's bag longer than it should have. It was folded thin, the edges softened by touch, and each time she felt it there, a small current ran through her, equal parts comfort and alarm. She told herself it was harmless to feel understood, that connection did not automatically become transgression. Yet the story she repeated to herself grew more elaborate, and elaborate stories are often defenses. Evan Brooks became a constant without announcing himself. He didn't ask for more time. He simply appeared in the moments Lena hadn't planned, by the printer when it jammed, at the end of meetings when the room thinned, in her inbox with questions that had answers but also invitations. He listened with the same attentiveness he'd shown from the start, and Lena found that she began to curate her thoughts for him, polishing them before she spoke, hoping he'd hear what she meant as much as what she said. Their conversations drifted toward the personal with a deceptive ease. Evan spoke about the shape of his days, how they repeated themselves until meaning thinned. He described a marriage that functioned efficiently, like a machine that no longer required attention. He never criticized Claire Brooks by name. He didn't need to. The absence of heat in his voice did the work for him. Lena listened, careful, empathetic, telling herself that compassion was a virtue even when it was inconvenient. She talked, too, though less freely at first. She admitted to choosing stability over desire, to measuring herself by usefulness. Evan nodded in recognition, and the nod felt like a promise, unspoken but potent, that her carefulness could be set down here, with him. It was a relief she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. Marcus Reed noticed the change sharpen in a habit. He caught Lena smiling at her phone, distracted during lunch, staying late without reason. "You don't owe anyone your quiet," he said one afternoon, not unkindly. "But be careful who you give it to." "I'm not giving anything," Lena replied too quickly. Marcus studied her for a beat, then let it go. "Just saying," he said, and walked away. The warning lingered, but so did Evan's presence. They began to share coffee breaks that stretched beyond their cups, evenings that bled into night. The office became a container for something unnamed, something that felt private even when it wasn't. Lena noticed how Evan's tone changed with her. Lower, slower, as if he were choosing his words with intention. She noticed how he watched her reactions, adjusting himself accordingly. It felt intimate without being intimate, And that ambiguity became its own kind of closeness point one evening. After a long review session, Evan suggested a walk instead of heading straight home. The city was cool and forgiving, the streets open enough to make confession feel possible. He spoke about a version of himself that had been patient for too long, about wanting to be brave without knowing what bravery required. Lena listened, the rhythm of their steps aligning. She wanted to tell him to go home, to tend to what he had. She also wanted to tell him she understood. "I don't want to be unfair," Evan said, stopping beneath a streetlight. "To anyone." The words landed between them, weighted with implication. Lena nodded, aware that agreement could be interpreted as permission. "Then don't be," she said softly, and meant it as guidance, not challenge. But guidance requires distance, and distance had already thinned. The next day, Evan sent a message that was entirely professional and somehow tender all the same. Lena replied with the same restraint, and still the exchange carried something extra, like a current beneath the surface. She felt herself learning the shape of his attention, how it moved toward her and lingered. She wondered when she had begun to rely on it that Claire's name surfaced more often, not as a barrier, but as context. Evan mentioned shared plans, domestic logistics, the choreography of a life that ran smoothly. Lena felt the weight of that life without seeing it, and the invisibility made it easier to ignore. She told herself she was not responsible for the gaps in someone else's marriage. She told herself that being needed was not the same as being chosen. The line crossed quietly, as lines often do. It wasn't marked by a single act, but by accumulation. The way Evan's messages arrived late at night, the way Lena waited for them, the way silence felt charged rather than empty. During a meeting, Evan reached to pass her a document, and their hands brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, and it echoed longer than it should have. Lena pulled back, heart racing, and Evan met her eyes with an apology that carried more than regret. Afterward, Lena sat alone, staring at her screen without seeing it. She felt the wrongness and the pull in equal measure. She thought of Claire as a silhouette, of Marcus's steady gaze, of the person she believed herself to be. She wondered when listening had turned into longing. That night, Evan sent a final message. "I don't want to complicate your life," it read, "but I don't want to pretend this isn't happening." Lena typed and erased again. The truth pressed close, demanding shape. She knew that naming something gives it power, and that silence can be a choice as active as speech. When she finally replied, her words were careful, balanced on the edge between honesty and restraint. "We need to slow down," she wrote. "Before we hurt people we can't afford to hurt." The response came quickly. "I know," Evan said. "I just don't know how to go back to before." Lena set her phone down and closed her eyes. She felt the ground shift beneath her, not violently, but enough to unsettle her footing. The moment ended without resolution, and that was the most unsettling part. It left her suspended between what she wanted and what she knew, aware that the next step, whichever direction she chose, would carry consequences she could no longer pretend not to see. Slowing down proved harder than Lena Hart expected. Intentions dissolved in practice, eroded by proximity and habit. Evan Brooks kept his distance for a day, then two, then drifted back into her orbit with a gentleness that felt apologetic rather than restrained. He spoke less, but when he did, the words landed with greater weight, as if scarcity had sharpened them. Lena noticed the cost first in herself. She woke earlier, mind already racing, replaying conversations and imagining endings she refused to choose. At work, she became precise to the point of rigidity, overcorrecting for the distraction she feared others could see. She told herself that control was a form of virtue, that if she managed the surface carefully enough, the depth would settle on its own. It didn't. The depth expanded. Evan's mood shifted in small, telling ways. He was attentive, then withdrawn, candid, then careful. When he mentioned Claire Brooks, it was with a new edge of discomfort, as if her name had become a test he was failing. Lena felt a tightening each time, a reflexive guilt that arrived before thought. She began to dread weekends, The stretches of time when Evan disappeared into a life she was not part of but could no longer ignore. Marcus Reed confronted her again, this time without preamble. "You're splitting yourself in two," he said, closing the door to her office behind him. "And it's making you smaller." Lena bristled. "You don't know that." "I know you," Marcus replied. "And I know when you're choosing quiet because it's easier than choosing right." The words landed hard. Lena looked away, ashamed of the relief she felt at being seen. "It's complicated," she said. "It always is," Marcus said gently. "That's how it gets in." The next escalation arrived, disguised as necessity. A looming deadline kept the team late, the office thinning until only Lena and Evan remained. The hours stretched, fatigue lowering defenses. When the work was finally done, the relief was palpable, shared. Evan leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "I don't want to go home like this," he said, voice rough. "Not when I can barely recognize myself." Lena should have left. Instead, she listened. They talked without structure, circling the same truths from different angles. Evan admitted that the life he'd built felt airtight and airless, that he'd mistaken endurance for integrity. Lena admitted that being needed had become a mirror she didn't want to break. The confessions were careful, stopping short of explicit promises, but their restraint made them feel heavier, more deliberate. When Evan reached for her hand, it was tentative, almost formal. Lena didn't pull away. The contact was brief, contained, and entirely sufficient to shatter the illusion that this was still a misunderstanding. She felt the choice crystallize, not into action, but into awareness. Whatever this was, it had crossed into territory that required a reckoning. Afterward, they separated quickly, the space between them thick with consequence. Lena walked home in a daze, the city sharp and unfamiliar. She thought of Claire as a real person now, not a silhouette, a woman with routines and expectations, with trust she had not consented to risk. The thought burned that Evan's messages became sporadic, then urgent. He vacillated between resolve and regret, between wanting to do the right thing and wanting relief from the weight of wanting. Lena answered less, choosing silence as a temporary salve. Each unanswered message felt like both discipline and loss. The breaking point arrived without drama. Evan asked to meet, his tone sober. They sat across from each other in the same cafe where this had once felt manageable. He spoke first, measured. "I can't keep pretending this is harmless," he said. "I'm hurting people. I'm hurting you." Lena nodded, surprised by the steadiness she felt. "We already crossed the line," she said. "The question is whether we keep going." Evan looked at her as if hoping she'd decide for him. The realization settled heavy in her chest. She understood then that his uncertainty was not temporary. It was the shape of him in this moment. Loving him, if that was the word, would mean carrying his indecision as well as her own. "I can't be the place you come to avoid your life," Lena said quietly. "And I won't be the reason someone else loses trust." Evan's face tightened, relief and grief colliding. "I don't want to lose you." Lena felt the truth of that, and the truth beneath it. "You already have," she said, not unkindly. They parted with an understanding that felt unfinished because it was. In the days that followed, Evan withdrew, turning inward to confront what he'd postponed. Lena focused on repair, not of the damage done, which felt beyond her reach, but of the self she'd compromised to feel chosen. Marcus noticed the change, this time with approval. "You're back," he said. "Not entirely," Lena replied. "But I'm moving." At night, the ache returned, sharper now that it had been named. Yet beneath it ran a thin vein of resolve. Lena knew the story wasn't over. Consequences rarely conclude on command, but she also knew she had reclaimed the right to choose what came next. The knowledge steadied her, even as it promised difficult days ahead. The quiet that followed felt deliberate, as if the world had agreed to give Lena heart room to think. She reorganized her days with intention, arriving on time, leaving on time, reclaiming the small rituals she had surrendered without noticing. The office returned to its neutral rhythm, and Evan Brooks became a presence defined by absence. No messages, no lingering glances, No accidental meetings that weren't accidental at all. When he did reappear, it was contained within professionalism. Evan spoke in meetings with the same clarity he always had, but something essential had dulled. He no longer searched the room for Lena's reactions. He no longer shaped his words toward her. The restraint was unmistakable, and it carried its own cost. Lena felt it as a clean pain, sharp but honest. Unlike the ache of ambiguity she had grown accustomed to, she learned, indirectly, that Evan had told Claire Brooks the truth, at least a version of it. There were no details offered, no dramatics, just the quiet fallout of consequences unfolding elsewhere. Lena did not ask questions. She knew enough to understand that whatever repair was attempted would be private and incomplete. Trust, once fractured, does not return to its original shape. Marcus Reed watched Lena closely during this time, offering steadiness without interrogation. He brought coffee without asking, walked her out after late meetings, filled the space with ordinary conversation. One evening, as they waited for the elevator, he said, "You chose yourself." Lena considered the statement. "I chose responsibility," she said. Marcus smiled. "Same thing, sometimes." Weeks passed. The campaign concluded. Evan's consultancy ended. On his final day, he stopped by Lena's desk with a small nod, an acknowledgement that asked for nothing. "I hope you're well," he said. "I am," Lena replied, surprised to find it true. After he left, the office felt unchanged, and that, too, surprised her. She realized then that what she had mistaken for inevitability had been intensity, and intensity fades when it is no longer fed. The realization didn't erase the past, but it softened its edges. Lena turned inward, not in retreat, but in assessment. She revisited the moments she had compromised herself, not to punish, but to understand. She noticed how easily she had confused being seen with being valued, how hunger can masquerade as destiny when left unattended. The insight was uncomfortable and necessary. One evening, she met Marcus for dinner. The conversation ranged from trivial to reflective, easy in a way that felt earned. As they parted, Marcus paused. "You know," he said, "you don't have to prove anything by being alone." Lena smiled. "I know. I'm not alone. I'm just not hiding." At home, she sorted through her bag and found the folded note Evan had written weeks ago. The paper was creased beyond repair. She read it once more, then tore it carefully and threw it away. The gesture felt ceremonial without being sentimental. Closure, she realized, does not announce itself. It arrives quietly when you stop reopening doors. In the months that followed, Lena accepted a new role within the firm, one that required confidence rather than accommodation. She spoke more directly, asked for what she needed, declined what she didn't. The change was noticed. It was respected. It altered the way she moved through rooms, no longer rehearsing exits before she arrived. Occasionally, Evan crossed her mind, not as temptation, but as context. He had been a catalyst, not a conclusion. The distinction mattered. It allowed her to hold the experience without romanticizing it, to acknowledge both the connection and the cost. One night, as rain traced the windows again, Lena felt the familiar quiet settle. This time it did not ache. She recognized herself in the stillness, intact and attentive. Love, she understood now, does not ask for erasure or secrecy. It does not thrive on borrowed space. Whatever came next would need to meet her in the open. She turned off the lights and went to bed, not with certainty, but with a steadiness that felt earned. The story had not ended. Stories rarely do. But the chapter had closed on her terms, and that made all the difference.